Hi, Tom here. In this week's Circle Line Art School video, I'll show you one way to draw a realistic eye, step by step. For this drawing, you'll just need a pencil, some paper, and an eraser. For my drawing, I use an A4 piece of paper so that I have the space to draw a big detailed image of an eye. I use a 4B pencil because it has a good tonal range from light to dark, but any pencil that you have would do. I use two erasers, one which is a mono eraser for erasing small areas with precision. If you don't have a mono eraser or something like that, you could use just the side edge of an eraser to erase small parts of your drawing precisely. The first step in this drawing is to draw a curved line for the top shape of the eye. All of the lines at the beginning of the drawing need to be soft lines so that we can have the opportunity to change and improve them over time. To create a soft line, just don't press too hard with the point of the pencil on the paper. Next, we can draw the area of the tear duct on the left of the eye. Draw another curved line for the base of the eye, and the base curved line of the eye needs to be slightly less curved than the top line. The next step is to draw the iris of the eye, the large circle. The top part of the circle will be underneath the top of the eye shape, the eyelid. And then we can draw the pupil in the center of the circle of the eye. When an eye is looking at a dark area, the pupil will be larger, and when an eye is looking at a light area, the pupil will be smaller to allow in less light. And then we can draw on the left hand side a shape which will become the reflection of light, so that's an area that we are not going to shade in, just to the top left of the pupil. But we can shade in the pupil, and that can be towards the darkest tone, the darkest tonal value that your pencil can create. So if you've got a soft dark pencil like a 4B pencil, you might be able to create a nice dark, flat tonal value for the center of the pupil. To create a flat tone, the flattest dark tone that you can for the pupil, which is the aim, use the side of the pencil point and shade in layers, each layer darker than the layer preceding it, until it looks really black. The next step we can do is to add some shading around the edge of the iris, the circumference of the circle, and this shading can be darkest at the actual circumference, the line of the circle, and then we can grade the shading so that the darkness by the line becomes softer and lighter as it goes a little bit towards the pupil in the center of the eye. And this shading will be at its darkest at the outside edge of the circle, at the outside edge of this iris of the eye that we're drawing. But then the shading can grade in as it goes towards the pupil, just a little bit. It can be graded in so it gets a little bit lighter. And we can do this just by changing the pressure that we put on the pencil point. So to get a very dark tone, you can just press more firmly with the pencil point, and then gradually you can use a lighter pressure to get this sort of graded tone from a dark outside of the iris to a lighter tone as it goes slightly towards the pupil. At this stage, it's probably a good idea to make sure that the lines look about right. So if the circle of the iris needs correcting, like my one does, we can do that at this stage. It's always a good idea as well just to keep looking at the whole of your drawing and correcting anything that you see that jumps out as not working so well. because if you can see that something's not quite right, that means that you can have a go at changing it and making it better. But if you don't correct things as you go along, you might forget the things that you notice that don't work so well, and then they'll be left in the drawing, and that won't be so good. When you're ready, with a very light, delicate line, we can use, with a sharp point of the pencil, we can draw some delicate lines, some delicate broken lines, coming from the circumference, the edge of the iris, towards the pupil in the center. Once you've mapped out these, like spokes of a bicycle wheel going to the center, but broken lines, so they're not continuous and solid, then we can redraw these lines, but this time making them slightly darker in areas, and then perhaps slightly wider as they go towards the edge of the iris. So they're like little slightly wiggly lines that go towards the center of the iris. And then we can change the darkness, and then we can break up the uniform quality of the tonal grade that we put around the iris at the beginning, so it's a little bit more sort of bumpy and broken, looking for small little shapes. As you're drawing this, it's good to try and be precise, but also slightly random. They're all going towards the center of the pupil, and they're not continuous lines. They sort of change in thickness from thick, dark lines to thinner lines, and then maybe thick lines again. And generally speaking, they're thicker towards the outside of the circle, towards the edge of the circle, and they get thinner as they go towards the center of the pupil, the center of the circle. These are really quite fine details, but later on we'll put a tonal value, some shading over the top of almost all of them. So as you're drawing these, they need to be quite dark, but changing in tone as well. So they're not uniform, so they're not all one tonal value, that they have a visual interest to them. They sort of change from light to dark. And they also change in the thickness from thick to thinner to thick. And just work your way around so that you're not working on one area too much. You're sort of moving the pencil around that you're drawing with, so that you start to build up the whole of the iris. Now, obviously, when you're drawing, you can only work on one thing at a time. But when you're looking at your drawing, it's a good idea, I think, to try and look at the whole drawing. Even though you're only drawing one part of it, you need to be able to see the whole drawing. And then in that way, you can sort of judge how the drawing's going, rather than just be judging the one particular mark that you're making. So the aim really is to be able to create these tones and marks that we need one by one, but also being aware of how the whole drawing looks. So we're sort of zoning in to detail, but sort of zooming out to see the whole thing at the same time. And in this way, we can start to build up a patchwork of lines going towards the pupil and center. And at this stage, just check your drawing and make sure that some of the lines are dark and some of the lines aren't quite so dark. And then when you're ready, use your pencil, the side of your pencil, and keep the side of the pencil at one angle, and then just gradually apply a shading over the top of the whole of the iris, apart from the shape that which is going to be the highlight. So sort of slightly rectangular shape on the top left above the pupil. That's the one area that we're not going to shade. But everything else you can just shade in the soft, even area. To make your shading as even as possible, try not to leave gaps as you shade and keep the pencil at a steady angle. And try not to get a dark tone too quickly, because you can get a dark tone by layering the tones one on top of another. Next, we can draw some more of the lines and shapes and the complicated patterns of shapes going towards the pupil. So we're making them even darker, but some of them. And it's not really a matter of drawing over the lines we've already got, but just inventing new lines on top. And now we can add another tonal value, which is just slightly darker than the first tonal value we put over the whole of the iris. And this time it will be more towards the top, because the top of the eye will create a sort of shadow, because the eye is set back from the eyelid. The eyelid's thicker. The eyelid is in front of the eye, so that will cause a slight shadow. So the top of the iris can be slightly darker. But I think I want the whole of the iris that I'm drawing darker anyway. So this next sort of tonal range, this next layer that I'm drawing, isn't quite as even as the first one, so that it has a visual variation to it. And I want to make sure that it is a little bit darker at the edges as it approaches the center of the pupil. So again, you need to look at your drawing and see if anything jumps out as not being quite right, or something that sort of just feels like it's out of place. And now we can repeat even more of the lines, concentric lines going towards the pupil. So now we're really building up lots of layers, and I think that's something that you see when you look into an eye. You see it as lots of different layers. It's not all like on the surface. You'll see through an eye to the layers below the top layer. And we can sort of give an indication of that by creating layers to our drawing, just as there are layers to the eyes that we can see when we look into an eye. Next, we could add another layer of tone if you think your eye needs it. As long as the tonal values that you put down, the flat shading of tone you put down, doesn't hide the intricate, subtle details that you've added, then it will be fine. Now we're at a stage where we can work into the drawing, not to erase things which are wrong, but to draw with an eraser so that we can add lighter lines to the eye that we're drawing. To do this, you could use the fine eraser if you have one, or you could just use the edge or a corner of a normal eraser, so that you can get some precise lines erased, so that you can make some precise lines in your drawing using an eraser. So that you can use the eraser that you have to draw some fine, lighter lines within the iris of the eye. If you find you use an eraser and maybe you erase slightly too much, then you can just go back and work into it with pencil. So it's balancing between light and dark. But this really is using an eraser to draw with, rather than using an eraser to take out something that doesn't work. So we're building up the layers by adding blocks and shapes and lines within the eye to make sure that nothing jumps out as being too strong, and we're building up this contrast of tonal values and broken shapes which have a general indication of going towards the center of the pupil. If there are any areas that are too dark, use an edge of an eraser just to bring them back a little bit. So we're getting to a stage now, I think, where it's about enough detail. There's nothing jumping out too much, and there's nothing too subtle you can't see it, but it's sort of, we're aiming so that you're sort of drawn into the eye, so that as you look at the eye you see more and you see more layers. And you'll find that as you draw these layers of tone and it becomes darker, the highlight, which we've left alone, will just look brighter because it's surrounded by darker tones. So in a drawing, any time where you put lots of dark shading, any area that you don't shade dark will look brighter than it did before you started the shading. Next, we can draw the area of the tear duct, which in this eye is on the left-hand side. So a little blob of a shape, which we can just sort of pin in with some edges and have a little bit of a highlight on it. And just using the side of the pencil so that the tonal range changes from light to dark to light. Not really any lines apart from the outside line. Next, when you're ready, the actual whites of the eyes are not going to be purely white, so you need to use, so it'd be best to use the side of a pencil and add a faint tonal value, using the sort of curve of the eye as the curve of the shading as you draw. And these tonal values, this shading that we're doing, will be darker towards the outside edges of the eye. But as this shading gets closer to the iris, the tonal value will become less and the shading will be lighter as it approaches the iris. So we can do this on the left-hand side and then the right-hand side too. Now this is just the first layer of shading, so it's just a rough layer, and we can blend it with the edge of an eraser and then add more layers as we go along, and then also use an eraser to lighten it if it gets too dark. But the aim is to have some tonal value to the whites of the eye, but nothing too strong. Iris is much, much darker than the whites of the eye. And in this drawing at this stage, the highlight just above the pupil is the only part of the drawing which hasn't got any shading and therefore looks a lot brighter than the surrounding areas. There are very few other parts. There are some parts which we've used an eraser to bring back the tone of the paper, but it's not exactly the same because it's been shaded and then the shading's been erased off, so it's not quite as bright as the paper before we did any shading to it. So the eye is a spherical shape, but it's encapsulated in the skin around it, the eyelid and the lower eyelid. So we only see a sort of almond shape part of this spherical eyeball. So when we shade the left hand side and the right hand side of the whites of the eye, it's good to be mindful that we're shading a part, a segment of a spherical, a ball-like shape. So the tonal values will be very gradual. There won't be any big jumps apart from the top part of the eye, because again the eyelid will be creating a shadow for the top part. But the rest of the eyeball, the parts, the segment of the eyeball that we can see, the tonal values need to be nice and blended and gradual, because on a spherical surface there's always a very gradual change of tonal values. but I will make the top line, the original line that we started the drawing with. Now I feel more content where it is. I can make it darker, so it needs to be quite a sharp, dark line, and that will sort of hold the drawing in place. And now we can really assess and judge how the drawing's going at this stage. Once you're ready, you could draw a line for the top part of the eyelid. So the top part of the eyelid just needs to be a soft line because it's a guideline. And then again, looking at the whites of the eyes, seeing if there's anything to erase or blend, anything that you could correct or improve at this stage. So we've got quite a lot of details that we need in the actual eye. So with the corners of the eyes and the shadow from the eyelid onto the eye, I'm just going to make that a little bit darker at its edges, but grading in by changing the tone of the pencil. So the top outline of the eye is not just a line, it's an area of tone that gradually gets lighter as it goes downwards from the top curved line of the eye. Around the eye there will be a thickness, a slight thickness of the skin, and we can just indicate that with a soft pencil line, echoing the two lines that we drew for the outline of the eye at the beginning. And now gradually we can add some tonal shading to the eyelid using the same curve as the curve of the eye. And again, this is just the first layer of tone, so it doesn't need to be too dark and it doesn't need to be too flat, so it's going to be graded, and it will just take time to build up the tones so that it doesn't become too dark too quickly. So we're really just sketching it in at this stage, but be careful that you go and sort of follow the direction of the curve of the eye, even for the shading. So we've started to knock back the tonal values of the eyelid to some extent, knowing that we'll make them darker later on. And remember, in this drawing, the only area that really has no shading on it will be the highlight, the area that catches the light just next to the pupil. So as we add more shading, that highlight becomes brighter. I'll make this line a little bit darker, and then we can pull the tone from that edge by adding more shading. So it's quite a large drawing of an eye, so the shading takes a little bit of time. Again, try and look at the whole eye, even though we're just blocking in the shading for the eyelid at the top. When you're ready, you could shade in the area below the eye. And then towards and around the tear duct. So the tear duct is a shape which is enveloped by the skin of the face on 3 sides and then the eye on the 4th side. As with all of the shading, when it's graded shading, it's best to use the side of the pencil, and then if you keep the side of the pencil at one angle, then the shading becomes more subtle. If you turn the pencil around in between your fingers, halfway round, then you'll find that the edge of the pencil will be sharp again, and then you can use that for any lines that you need. Even though at this stage we've got quite a lot of tone, extra tone, the whites of the eye need to be a little bit brighter than the skin which surrounds the eye. So you might need to work back into that. And then the tonal values, we can add another layer of tone onto the top eyelid, and then just stop and pause and see how it's going. Again, checking if anything jumps out too much, if any of the lines are too strong or not in the right direction. You could use the side of an eraser just to smudge them a little bit. The next step is to draw the eyelashes, and there are lots, so let's get into that. So to draw the eyelashes, they're all going to be slightly different, but just they're like little hooks curving around, and they're all going to be a little bit different, and sometimes they sort of clash. They're not like always parallel to each other. So draw them one by one and see what works. Because it's a large drawing of the eye, the eyelashes are also going to be quite large too. The darkest area will be just above the eye. So this is a very good stage again to look at the whole eye, even though we're drawing individual eyelashes one by one. We want to look at the whole eye and see what works. And we can also go into any areas and add a little bit of shading to them as well, just to check that we're going in the right direction. So we could stop the drawing here. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you find it useful for your own drawings. If you like, I hope you press the like button and subscribe to keep up to date with all of the content that I make. If you'd be interested in learning more, please visit my website, circlelineartschool.com, where you'll find full details of my online drawing courses for beginners. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.